The War of 1812 explained what really happened. What if I told you the United States once declared war on the most powerful empire in the world, with almost no army, a tiny navy, and no real plan? Sounds crazy, right? Well, that's exactly what happened in 1812. This war saw the White House burned to the ground, legendary naval battles, and even gave us the national anthem. So how did this near disaster shape America's future? Let's dive in. So, why did the United States decide to take on the British Empire again? Barely 30 years after the Revolutionary War? Well, the short answer: a mix of impressment, trade restrictions, territorial ambitions, and good old-fashioned paranoia. Let's start with one of the biggest triggers: impressment. The British Royal Navy was notorious for stopping American ships, seizing sailors, and forcing them to serve in British ranks. Britain claimed it was just reclaiming deserters, former British sailors who had abandoned their navy and found work on American merchant ships. But in reality, impressment became a massive overreach of power. Thousands of actual American citizens were kidnapped, their identities ignored or dismissed, and they were forcibly conscripted into British service. Imagine being an American sailor, peacefully working aboard your ship, when suddenly, a British warship intercepts you. You're boarded by armed officers, questioned, and, whether you have proof of citizenship or not, dragged away against your will. One moment, you're trading goods between New York and France, and the next, you're on a British warship, forced to fight in a war you had no part in. And the worst part? The US government could do little to stop it. This wasn't just about the suffering of individual sailors. It was an outright violation of American sovereignty. The United States had only gained independence a few decades earlier, but Britain was treating its citizens like they were still British subjects. The issue struck at the very core of American identity: if a foreign power could seize its citizens at will, was the US really independent at all? And speaking of Britain disregarding US sovereignty, Britain and France were already going at it in the Napoleonic Wars, and, like two toxic exes fighting over custody of global trade, they both wanted the US on their side. But America? America just wanted to be left alone to make money. Unfortunately, that wasn't an option. Britain, determined to starve France into submission, imposed a naval blockade, essentially stationing its navy in the Atlantic like a giant "do not enter" sign for American merchants. If a US ship so much as thought about trading with France, Britain would seize it, confiscate its cargo, and sometimes even force its sailors into British service. Shout out to impressment, again. It was economic blackmail, plain and simple. And this wasn't just a mild inconvenience for American businesses, it was a disaster. Imagine you're a farmer in Virginia, expecting to make bank selling your tobacco overseas. Well, guess what? Your ship just got stopped by the British. Your goods were seized, and now you're stuck with a warehouse full of rotting crops. Or say you're a merchant in Boston, eager to ship textiles to Europe. Too bad, because your ship is sitting in the harbor collecting dust, and your customers are getting impatient. This blockade didn't just hurt the wealthy elite, it crippled the entire US economy. Trade collapsed, businesses went bankrupt, and entire industries suffered. It was like being forced into a one-sided business deal with an abusive partner, one who held all the power and wasn't afraid to use it. Naturally, Americans were furious. They had fought an entire war to break free from British rule. Yet here was Britain, still treating them like a disobedient colony. It wasn't just about the money, the losing money certainly didn't help. For many, this felt like a direct attack on American independence itself. And for some US politicians, the solution was becoming clear: if Britain wasn't going to respect American sovereignty, maybe it was time to remind them, by force. But economic warfare wasn't the only thing pushing the US towards war. Because while Britain was busy harassing American ships at sea, it was also stirring up trouble on land. To many Americans, the real solution wasn't just ending British interference, it was getting rid of Britain in North America altogether. Why settle for just stopping impressment and trade restrictions when you could kick the British out entirely and maybe gain some new land in the process? Enter the War Hawks, a group of young, aggressive politicians who had two main goals: defend American honor and expand US territory. And what was the most tempting target? Canada. At the time, Canada was a British colony with a tiny population, weak defenses, and a whole lot of land. The war hawks figured, why not just take it? Their logic was simple. Canada was right next door. British forces were tied up fighting Napoleon in Europe, and Americans vastly outnumbered the British soldiers stationed there. In their minds, this war would be fast, easy, and wildly successful. Spoiler alert, it was not. One war hawk, Kentucky Congressman Henry Clay, was especially enthusiastic, famously predicting that conquering Canada would be a mere matter of marching. Because, Canada is just sitting there, waiting to be conquered, right? Not quite. This level of overconfidence was almost admirable, if it weren't so disastrously wrong. But the war hawks weren't just worried about British troops in Canada. They were convinced that Britain was secretly helping Native American tribes resist American expansion. And to be fair, they weren't entirely wrong. Britain had been providing weapons and supplies to Native groups, particularly in the Northwest Territory, modern-day Midwest. By the early 1800s, settlers were racing across the frontier like it was a Black Friday sale, snatching up land and pushing deeper into Native American territory. Thanks to the Louisiana Purchase, the U.S. now had way more land than it knew what to do with. And Americans wasted no time in claiming it as their own. By 1812, over 400,000 settlers had pushed west, overwhelming native tribes. Some, like the Cherokee under John Ross, tried adopting European ways, farming, written language, even slavery, hoping settlers would back off. Spoiler, they didn't. Meanwhile, Tecumseh had a different idea: fight back. His brother, Tenskwatawa, aka the Prophet, preached rejecting European goods and booze. Tecumseh took it further, rallying tribes under pan-Indianism. You can't sell land you don't own. America's response? Guns. William Henry Harrison crushed Prophetstown in 1811, wrecking Tecumseh's movement. The U.S. blamed Britain for backing native resistance, rightly so. And just like that, the War of 1812 became another war against Native Americans, who, as always, lost the most. Alright, so America finally decided to declare war, for the first time in its young history. America's first war declaration barely squeaked by in Congress, because not everyone was thrilled about it. Northern states, reliant on trade, didn't want to tick off Britain. Southern and western states, hungry for land, and, let's be real, more slavery, were all for it. But was America ready? Not even close. The Army had 10,000 troops, mostly led by clueless or drunk officers. The Navy? A whopping 17 ships. Meanwhile, Britain had 1,000 ships and 40 times America's tax revenue. Thankfully, they were busy fighting Napoleon until 1814, when they finally turned their full attention to America. America's grand strategy? Invade Canada, because that went so well before. General William Hull assured Canadians they'd be emancipated from tyranny. Canada collectively shrugged and said, "Nah, we're good." Then the British and their native allies promptly took Detroit. Embarrassing. Meanwhile, the British torched Washington, D.C., including the White House. British Admiral George Cockburn even ordered printers to burn the letter C, so no one could mock his name. Priorities. Despite the chaos, America managed some wins. The USS Constitution earned its Old Ironsides nickname. Oliver Hazard Perry won a naval battle on Lake Erie, and William Henry Harrison defeated Tecumseh, who, fun fact, had more dignity than all of Congress combined. And then came Andrew Jackson. First, he played native tribes against each other at Horseshoe Bend, killing 800. Then, at the Battle of New Orleans, he annihilated 2,000 British troops, 2 weeks after the war had already ended. Yes, the Treaty of Ghent had been signed, but news traveled slower than Congress making a decision. Still, Jackson's pointless victory made him a national hero, which, unfortunately, helped him become president. So, who won the War of 1812? Well, nobody. The US and Britain basically called it a draw and signed the Treaty of Ghent. But if anyone definitely lost, it was Native Americans, who suffered huge casualties and lost even more land. That said, the war wasn't pointless. It confirmed that the US was here to stay. Britain never invaded again, well, until 1961, but that's another story. The war also boosted Andrew Jackson's career. sped up expansion east of the Mississippi, and, fun fact, made sure the US and Canada stayed separate. Meaning America is forever Canada's pants. Meanwhile, the Federalist Party tried to tweak the Constitution at the Hartford Convention, pushing for stuff like ending the 3/5 compromise and requiring a 2/3 majority for war declarations. But thanks to Jackson's New Orleans victory, they just looked unpatriotic, proving once again that bad timing kills careers. So, in the end, the War of 1812 didn't really change borders, but it did change history. And hey, at least we got a cool national anthem out of it. So next time you hear the Star-Spangled Banner, just remember, it was written during a war that nobody really won, but somehow still mattered.